right, what up, listeners? Psych Guys podcast here. We got Dr. Logan Noone and my colleague, Dr. Joon Chun.
Yeah, you said it right.
I finally
Logan.
got it right,
What is this,
dude?
episode number 25, 26, somewhere around there?
I don't know, man. It's great. So we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects today, good old sleep, and relevant to teenagers. It seems like, everyone kind of knows that teenagers stay up later and later as they age. But the sad thing is we don't really adjust their schedule. We just kind of make them eat it and show up to school tired. And it seems so interesting to me because it's like, okay, we're trying to get these individuals to be stimulated at school, to learn at school, yet we are totally okay with having them show up completely fatigued. It mostly just seems like we want students, teenagers ages 12 to 18 to just be able to fit in the world that adults live in. Because in some regard, going to school is like a babysitting service, right? The adults, do their work and then they can drop these kids off at a school. A lot of the literature is talking about how, a lot of the reasons why these schools started so early because typical work days for parents started this early. Now, in the world we live in now, post-COVID, so many parents are working from home these days, yet a lot of schools are still starting at 7:30 in the morning. What time did you start high school when you were there?
Too early, my friend. So interesting thing with me is I actually grew up in Queens, New York, but my high school was in Brooklyn. So I had about an hour and 20-minute commute each way. I would take a bus to the train station and take 2 different trains to get there. My very first class started at about 8 a.m., but because it took me such a long time to get there, I would essentially have to wake up at like 5:45. And fun little fact about me, Logan, during my senior year of high school, I had gym for first period at 8 a.m., and I had such a hard time getting up. I actually was late so many times to gym that I actually failed. Couldn't go to graduation, wow. Man. I wasn't allowed to go to prom.
Oh, my God. That was your junior year or senior year?
Senior year. I had to go to summer school my senior year.
Damn, dude.
Because that hurts, right?
Gym. And then you ended up being a doctor, which is actually quite comical. Right. But man, I thought I had it bad. My first period was at 7:15, I remember.
Oh, that's early.
It is early. But I didn't have as crazy of a commute. Even if I were to take the bus, I remember I would get picked up at I don't know, maybe 6:45. But thankfully, by the time I was a junior and senior, I would, my mom worked in the school district so she could drop us off, or I eventually had my own vehicle. So it was like a 10, 15-minute commute, rather easy. Now, of course, I was still almost late every single day, driving like a typical 16-year-old boy, race car driver style, racing my way there every single day. And I remember every single day feeling utterly exhausted and not being able to really concentrate until, a couple hours into school. How many people can relate to that?
Logan, we had such a different experience. Growing up in New York City, most of us never took the school bus. We all commuted by train, and literally none of us drove until we graduated high school. We were all just taking public transportation. So I guess we come from vastly different worlds, but now we're together in this world of psychiatry and this world of mental health, and I think this is a great place to start the conversation. I'm going to throw out a stat at you, Logan. So more than 80% of public high schools in the U.S. begins before 8:15 a.m., and almost half of those start before 7:20 a.m. So I think on the surface, it doesn't sound that bad, but you alluded to this a little bit earlier, Logan. We have to remember that the circadian rhythm for high school students is different. It's not the same as an adult. So we know, so sleep was something that wasn't understood maybe even 30, 40 years ago, but we have a much better understanding of sleep, of circadian rhythms today. And we've learned that when you hit puberty, your circadian rhythm gets delayed by 2 to 4 hours. So what does that mean? Essentially, for a teenager waking up at 5:15 a.m. and if you're starting school at 7:20 a.m., a lot of people have to wake up at 5:15 a.m. That means for you and me, that would be the equivalent of waking up at 3:15 a.m. Now, tell me how ridiculously ridiculous that sounds, Logan. Imagine I told you you have to wake up at 3:15 for work every single day, and I expect you to show up to work on time. I expect you to conduct yourself in a professional manner. I expect you to learn everything that I tell you, and you have to be on your best behavior. And on top of that, I need you to do it day after day after day for years and years and years. How you feel about that, Logan? That's ridiculous.
And I would be, obviously, it comes down to academic performance. I wouldn't be able to perform at my best, and, the whole America's number one is not true when it comes to academic performance, right? We are not necessarily the best at math, reading, all these things, but it's more than that, right? It's even, there's immune function that's relevant to sleep quality. And of course, what our favorite subject is at the end of the day, mental health. And, I graduated high school 2007. I'm kind of an old head, right? I'm sitting here 34 years old. Why is this so relevant to talk about today? Here's one stat that I want to throw at you, June. Beginning in March 2020 and through October of that year, the proportion of mental health visits in the emergency room, this is nationwide, among pediatric visits increased by 24% compared to 2019. So this was, of course, in the midst of COVID, ages 5 through 11. So up 24% from the year prior compared to 2019. And it rose by 31% ages 12 to 17. So basically, what we always knew that this was kind of an issue. When I was in high school, I remember complaining all the time about how we all knew that it would be smarter to start schools later, right? But I think that this is even more relevant today because teenagers are suffering. Teenagers are more depressed than they used to. There's more suicide attempts than they used to. It is a tough world. COVID, of course, led to the most fatalities with elderly population, people of immunocompromised, but I would argue that it had the most mental health damages on our youth.
Right, and that's one of the main reasons why there's such a push for delayed school times, right? And, it's weird because even a century ago, did you know that schools in the U.S. started at about 9 a.m.? And as a result, 95% of students woke up without an alarm clock. Now, the inverse is true. Almost everybody needs an alarm to wake up, right, because of this ridiculously early start to school. And, when we're talking about the relationship between sleep and mental health, we have to remember that especially REM sleep is very, very important to mental well-being. And let me explain, Logan. So, I mentioned earlier that even a few decades ago, sleep was not very well understood. So there was a very interesting experiment that was done in the 1960s. So a group of researchers, they got together a bunch of young people, right, young adults, and they deprived them of REM sleep. So they would have them in a lab, they would monitor their sleep patterns, and whenever they fell into REM sleep, they would barge into the room, wake them up, and they would make them do math problems for 5 to 10 minutes, right? Imagine, how pleasant does that sound?
It sounds like one of our calls.
Exactly. Maybe that's the cool experiment that's ongoing right now. But anyway, they would barge in, they would make them do math problems for 5 to 10 minutes, thus effectively preventing them from returning to this dream state. And they did this hour after hour, day after day. And this experiment was supposed to go on for 7 days. But the interesting thing that happened was that by day 3, the participants, they actually began to exhibit signs of psychosis. They began to hallucinate, they became anxious, and they became moody. Some of them even became paranoid. They started believing that the researchers were secret government agents that were trying to poison them. And you have to remember, when we talk about these early starts to high school, the age demographics of our students, late teenage years, this is the age range where patients are most susceptible to developing anxiety, depression, and even serious mental illness such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So we're taking a group of people at an especially vulnerable time in their lives and subjecting them to this process that we know can have detrimental effects to their mental health outcome.
Yeah, I mean it's cruel. That's the first word that comes to my mind. Just utterly, utterly cruel. These are individuals. Like I feel how a society is judged is how they treat their most vulnerable. In my eyes, that's the elderly and the young. And in many ways, I feel that we're just being so harmful, knowingly harmful. Like everyone, I mean, of course, we're scientists, we're medical doctors. Like we can spit out all these stats, but everyone, it's kind of common knowledge that teenagers do not sleep enough, not adequately. There's physiological reasons for that now in the world of cell phones, and I kind of want to get into the stats of that. But I think it's important for the listeners to acknowledge this fact. So there was a longitudinal study that looked at adolescents from ages 10 to 12, and they followed them all the way until age 15 to 18. And what they did is they must have had this special school program where they gave them a full 10 hours of sleep opportunity. They said, go to bed whenever you want. It's no big deal. We'll manage this curriculum around your lives and just make it work. Then they took an average of what sleep they really wanted, because if you want to try to figure out what exactly the amount of sleep that you need, that's actually kind of the best way to calibrate and measure it for yourself. One of my favorite sleep researchers is Matthew Walker. I know you have his book at his house. If you guys like his podcasts, he's been on a lot of big name podcasts, Matthew Walker. And he talks a lot about this, that how most people, of course, need to sleep between 8 hours roughly or so, but there is some variability there. But one of the best ways to measure kind of the sleep that you need is when you're on vacation, don't use an alarm and just see the natural time you fall asleep, how much sleep you typically get. So that's what happened in this study. And they found that in that age range, so remember this is ages 10 to 18, on average, they needed 9.25 hours of sleep regardless of age. That was just kind of on average. There was another study that looked at 50,000 U.S. high school students. These were grades 9 through 12, and 2/3 of them reported having 7 hours of less of sleep per night. So it's, 2/3 of our population in high school is not getting nearly enough sleep.
That's pretty much what I would have guessed. So, I mean, I guess the obvious answer and one of the easiest ways that we can contribute to getting our adolescent population increased amount of sleep is to delay school start times. And some of you listeners might be wondering, hey, like, why can't we tell, teenagers to fall asleep earlier? But the problem with that is that, as we mentioned earlier in this show, that your biological circadian rhythm as a teenager is significantly delayed. Actually, the natural sleep time for a teenager is around 11 p.m.
Right.
So, of course, if you're starting school at 7:20 a.m., you don't have 9 hours to sleep and also get ready for school, right? So that's the inherent conflict right there. Knowing that delayed school start times can contribute to the betterment of sleep quality and subsequently their mental health, I want to kind of talk about what are some of the forces that's fighting against a later start to the school day. Logan, any guesses?
The forces fighting against a later start to the school day. I guess I kind of touched on it earlier, like parental needs. There's a lot of parents that do need that kind of, in a sense, right, babysitting component of what a high school provides so that they can go to school and, they can go to work and not have to worry about where their kids are going. We saw this in COVID. Parents had to figure out where these kids would be going when they couldn't go into school. Outside of that, my mother was a teacher, so I'm all too familiar with teachers' unions. But I would think that the teachers' unions would want to see delayed times. I mean, it would be, if I was a teacher, I'd be stoked if I could show up a little bit later in the day. I do think there's some concerns. Does this mean then that the school day has to be pushed out longer because we're starting it later in the day too? I wanted to actually do a case or talk about one high school in particular that was offering some solutions around that, but I'll get into that later. So what are the forces pushing against delaying school starts times?
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to touch on, and I'm kind of piggybacking off your points about, the role of the school as this quote-unquote babysitter, right, is actually, so the school day, there's a fundamental mismatch between school times and the American workday, right? The workday goes until 5 to 6 p.m. And the way that schools are structured right now, generally by 3 p.m. students are done with their school day. So that leaves a period of 3 hours of unsupervised time for a lot of American families out there. And actually, this is actually called the danger time zone. And it's been pretty well documented that during this 3-hour time span, we have, a lot of families will put their children into extracurricular activities, whether that be additional education or even stuff like sports. And the issue there is especially affects children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who necessarily don't have access to such after-school activities. And when you don't have access to those activities and you're essentially home by yourself as a teenager during the hours of 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., it's well documented that window, that 3-hour period, is a big contributor to substance abuse and crime rates for adolescent population. So one of the factors contributing against this push for delayed school time is actually a lack of funding, right? To be able to push that school time back and cover schools until 5 to 6 p.m., we would effectively have to extend the hours a little bit. And there's a lot of pushback, from funding, because already schools are kind of underfunded in our country. But the issue with that is, like I said, it affects children from lowest socioeconomic backgrounds the most, because people with the means are effectively subsidizing the school system already, because they're paying out of pocket for their children to be in extracurriculars. So when we talk about inequities of healthcare, perhaps this is one major area where it can be addressed. So that's the first one, Logan. The second thing, you talked about unions. So it's actually not the teachers' unions, but it's the bus unions that are against this change. And a big part of that reason is, Logan, the way the bus system is designed right now, they don't have separate buses for high schools, junior high schools, and elementary schools. They have staggered start times so that one bus will go pick up the high school students, then the junior high school students, then the elementary school students. And of course, we have concerns about the youngest of our, patients in the schooling demographic standing outside in the dark. So naturally, out of those three choices, it becomes the high school students that get the short end of the stick, right? And what does that really mean? It means that in order to delay the start time for high school students and still keep the same school start times for junior high school and elementary school students, they would effectively have to hire more bus drivers, and they would even have to add more buses to their fleet. So again, at the end of the day, it's a money equation, right? So that's the second point. And the third and the last force that's fighting against delayed school time is actually the sporting industry. A lot of coaches, a lot of parents that have their children involved in sports, they're showing a lot of resistance to this idea because, they're used to everything being done at a certain time, right? And a delayed school start time would mean a delayed end time, and that would throw off all the schedules for their games. They would have less hours for practice. So there's a lot of pushback there, which I think is very interesting because there's a lot of evidence that says sleeping more reduces risks for injury, and it can even increase your performance for athletic activities.
Right. So, I think a lot of it has to do with, how you would actually structure this potential delayed start time. So I think this is relevant now to kind of talk about. So what this article, you sent me this article and said, hey, let's do a podcast episode on this. It looked at Upper Darby High School, which is a high school out here in Pennsylvania, not actually all that far from where we're talking, okay? And so how they did this was, it was like I guess, how would you define this? Asynchronous education. What that means, it was almost like recorded lectures, where the school day technically still started at 7:20 a.m., okay, so it's still, the school day then still ended at 2:30 or 3 p.m., whatever, so that sports could still go on. But the students didn't have to view those lectures necessarily right at 7:30. They could do it on their own time. They could even do it on their commute. I actually think about you, who's someone who had, an hour and 15-minute commute, something crazy. You could have done two different classes during that time period if you could log in with your phone. I forget how old you are, June, but I personally didn't have a smartphone when I was in high school. So this wouldn't have worked when I was in high school, but I think this makes the most amount of sense to me. Some quotes from some students at that high school who implemented this policy. I'll be honest, I've been much happier in the mornings. I've been more positive. I've come to school smiling more often, grudging out of bed, stuff like that at 7:30 a.m. Students just reported being more happy, they reported having more energy, and just liked the autonomy of doing it on their own time. They felt like a little bit more adults. There's a lot of large school systems looking to implement very similar things like this. Denver, Philadelphia, and Anchorage, Alaska. What I also think that this is very interesting is if you think of this, kind of tele-education sort of model, you don't need actually as many teachers. You could actually hire one of the best math educators or whatever, history teachers, to kind of teach a universal course, and that could be distributed to high school students all over. Because we, of course, know that there's this huge teacher shortage. Teachers are overworked, are underpaid, they really have a very difficult job. So maybe a structure like this, if they could actually record some of their lectures, could actually be easier for the teachers and also easier for the students.
So effectively, you're eliminating the transportation time, and thus the students are able to get more sleep.
Right. That was at least how it implemented here. Some of the articles I was reading that they did actually delay the entire day. So instead of finishing at 3 p.m., they would finish at like 5 p.m. But I think that this strategy of having some kind of tele-education be the reason how they can get away with starting the program later in the day, and then give that student the autonomy. Try to treat these high school kids like adults. I know they're not adults yet, but I think part of the maturation process is treating them like adults, talking to them like adults, giving them respect, and giving them some limited amount of autonomy so they can develop into productive adults.
Logan, I love the idea of eliminating transportation time for all our students, because when we talk about inequities that exist within our education system, one of the biggest ones that we necessarily don't think about all that often is the fact that children with lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they're much more likely to have parents who are working jobs that demand an extremely early start time. And when you compare it to students with parents from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, those parents are more likely to start at a later time, like 9 a.m., so they're able to drive their children to work. So it's a quicker commute, and they don't have to take the school bus, right? So already there's a huge discrepancy there. So if we're able to eliminate the transportation time and kind of level that playing field, I think that's a very big positive change. However, I would question how much of a pushback would we get from teachers' unions, right? When we talk about recording these lectures, that I immediately think, okay, so I feel like they're going to take that and use that as a way to eliminate jobs from teachers. I feel like there will be significant pushback. Your mother was a teacher. What do you think?
Right. I mean, and so she had to deal with this personally in COVID, right? Where it was just sort of like, well, we got to do something, right? We got to be able to offer these students something. And so teachers did have to adapt. And there certainly was pushback from unions because it was not written in their contract that they would have to be these tele-educators, because we didn't know that was the world we were going to live in. Look, I would just say we don't have a problem that there's too many teachers without a job. We have too few of teachers. So what I hope is maybe an approach to this is, because we both went to college at, I don't know, did you ever take a college class where you were sitting around with like 500 colleagues, one of those huge student classes?
Too many.
Right. So I feel like that's part of that when you do that tele-education model. It kind of loses some of that personal component of teaching. You don't necessarily get to know your educator. But what I would hope would develop is more of a close-knit mentoring opportunity, tutoring opportunity, where maybe if some of these teachers especially said, hey, look, I do not have any interest in being a teleeducator. Maybe there's other teachers that do have a very interest in being a teleeducator. They're very skilled in that particular modality. Maybe those other teachers could be more of a tutor kind of role, and I cannot stress this enough. I do feel very strongly that teachers are overworked and underpaid. So maybe this could actually lead to improved job satisfaction.
Well, I think that's a great way to think about it. And at the end of the day, I think it would lead to drastic differences in terms of ultimate life outcomes for our students. Because if you think about it, if there's any way that we can potentially increase the amount of sleep that our students are getting, that can have tremendous effects downstream. So here's why I say that, Logan. So they actually did one of these later school start times in Edina, Minnesota. They actually used to start at 7:25 a.m. Yeah, Minnesota, leading the charge, setting an example for the country. Who knew? So they used to have start school times at 7:25 a.m. and then they delayed it to 8:30 a.m. So when that happened, they measured the SAT scores of the year prior to that change and the year after that change. So here's the stats. The year before times changed, average verbal SAT scores in the top performing tier of students was a 605. The following year, after that change, that score in the same top performing bracket of students rose to 761. So think about that. It changed from a 605 to a 761. And similar results happened in SAT math scores. So when we're talking about these drastic differences, think about what that means for a life of a student. It can potentially change the tier of college that they can be accepted into, thus effectively changing possibly the course of their lives.
Right, and it's interesting you bring that up because there's actually some studies I looked at that delaying start times of schools increases weekday sleep duration, In later times, we can never say correlation equals causation, but later start times were correlated with improved attendance, less tardiness, less falling asleep in class, better grades, and fewer motor vehicle accidents. So, I mean, there's so many benefits. I'm surprised on that list, improved mood. I would be curious to see if there's, even athletic performance here, in high schools. And because I always just remember feeling utterly exhausted. So we only have a little bit of time left, June. What I really want to finish this episode is talking about screen time. I didn't have a smartphone when I graduated high school. I had one of those flip phones. So I think that's extremely relevant to this conversation. There was one study that I read that I burst out laughing because it said 60% of adolescents report viewing or interacting with a screen within 1 hour before bedtime. Do you believe that stat?
60%?
Yeah.
That sounds very low.
Right. I think that's the dumbest stat I've ever heard in my life.
They're lying.
100%. It was a self-reported adolescent study.
Oh, self-reported. There we go.
Now, granted, this was from, I believe it was 2014, 2015. I'd have to double check. But,
okay.
I mean, in the world of 2023, that number's got to be 90, 95%. I really only think it would be adolescents, maybe with great discipline, or parents that are really willing to say, give me that goddamn phone, and you do not have a television in your room. Because, look, I have nieces and nephews. We always joke that they kind of lack in some social skills because they are just always on their phone, just nonstop. And there's some very interesting physiology around this that I want to talk about. Okay, so, we always hear in the news, this whole thing about blue wave lights that has to do with shorter wavelengths actually are more effective than longer wavelengths at suppressing melatonin levels, phase shifting the circadian clock, acutely increasing alertiveness, and altering subsequent sleep. Okay, so in short, the blue light is more harmful for sleep than the longer wavelengths. Okay, we've seen this in the news, but I think it's very interesting. Okay, why is this? And children are actually more sensitive to this than adults. Okay, it actually has to do with the ophthalmologic features of their eyes. Okay, so children relative to adults actually have a larger pupil size. So they do get more light into their eye compared to adults. And there's also increased light transmission rate of the crystal lens. So what's even more interesting, it actually has to do with age too. Younger children actually have more of this melatonin suppression compared to their adolescent colleagues. So this is so relevant to kids, right? You know, how many times do kids have their own cell phone? I mean, what? Kids are getting their own cell phone at the age of like 10 these days, right? Or a parent will just hand them you know, an iPad or whatever to shut them up at the end of the night, or watching television just towards the end of the night. You know, what do you think about this?
Well, first of all, you only had a flip phone in high school, huh?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so first of all, I think that you're a dinosaur. That's point number one.
I got some gray in this beard.
And number two, it's not even using the cell phones before bed, but how many teenagers are actually sleeping with their phones under their pillow, on their nightstands, and every time they wake up, you know, if they wake up during the night, I would argue that almost everybody has this impulsive reaction to want to check their time. You know, they look at their phones and they're getting some of that blue light again, right? And it's very interesting to hear how teenagers talk about it. They kind of say, I know I shouldn't do it, but I can't help it. Almost like an addict would talk about their substance of choice. It's crazy how much pull these devices have, and the impact that it's having on the quality of sleep that our youngest population is getting.
Right. And, you know, maybe an area of research that really I want to go into, because I didn't really find good research that I liked when I was researching this topic. You know, we keep saying screen time, screen time, screen time. But is all screen time equal here? Is scrolling through your Instagram feed or TikTok feed the same kind of alert stimulation that someone gets from playing a video game? Are different video games different? Is like an intensive Call of Duty different than someone who's playing, you know, Mario, or maybe even like some lower intensity game that's just sort of for fun, you know, versus some like potentially violent, or like versus a sports game? What about television? You know, is watching a cell phone versus watching a TV really radically different? What about how far away that screen is from your eyes? For me personally, look, I of course, me and you are doctors. I'm still playing with my phone at the end of the night. Every once in a while, I'll have perfect sleep hygiene, but that is extremely rare. There's a lot of times I'm engaging with my screen. But what I've learned I love video games. We've done episodes on video games. I can't play video games late at night. Video games, most especially, get me ramped up. I am just charged. I am just so into that game. I am having so much fun. Versus, you know, when I'm watching, especially like a casual television show that's not all that stimulating, maybe old episodes of Seinfeld, old episodes of The Office, I'm not as alert and in tune because I've already seen the episodes. I'm kind of whatever with the plot. I have a much easier time falling asleep engaging with that kind of screen time. So I really wonder, you know, we just talk about screen time, this blue light stuff, and I get it, you know, it's physiologically relevant, but the quality of screen time, the engagement of that screen time, I think is important too.
That's an interesting thing to think about, because I wonder what happens if instead of playing games, instead of watching Netflix, you're reading a book on your Kindle app, right? Because there's been studies that looked at reading a book compared to using a cell phone. It didn't necessarily specify what activities they were doing on their cell phone, but it showed pretty clear evidence that cell phone use is linked with a decreased in terms of the hours of sleep that you were getting at night, versus people that were reading books, magazines, so these so-called older forms of entertainment. It actually did not have any impact on their sleeps. So they were able to put their books down, they were able to put their magazines down at an appropriate time and get a full nights of rest. And not even just the question about what exactly is the type of content they're consuming on their devices. I would also throw into the equation how long they're using the device for during a day, because there are studies done, and there seems to be an inflection point at around 2 hours of use. So teens who spend 2 or more hours a day on their electronic devices were 28% less likely to get 7 hours of sleep. And actually, teens who visited social media sites every day were 19% more likely not to get an adequate night of sleep. So there you have it. After 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours seems to be that inflection point. So, look, Logan, in today's world, I don't think it's reasonable to expect anybody, let alone our teenagers, to not use social media, to not use cell phones. But I think as psychiatrists, as clinicians for whom sleep quality and sleep time is very, very relevant to the pathology and the outcomes that we see, we need to do a better job of educating our patients on what the appropriate limit, the upper limit would be on the recommended amount of screen time. And perhaps that can lead to a better outcome, and perhaps that's the most reasonable approach, because I think we're going to lose a lot of people. A lot of people are going to tune us out if we just said, hey, you can't be using that. You can't be doing that.
Right. And like I was saying earlier, I personally live in a rather small apartment. Getting more books is leading to clutter. I'm actually not even much of a reading person, but I greatly prefer audiobooks, right? Like that's how I consume that kind of literature, so I think how we engage with that screen time is so important here. And, I'm kind of, in a sense, talking out of my ass. I don't have good actual data, but I do think that there are some theories that maybe could be applied here. If you're using that phone, but you're not, or that screen, but not actively engaging with it, I do think that that's better than strongly engaging, scrolling actively with your thumb, engaging in that video game where you're actively doing something versus something that's a little bit more passive. You're not actively doing something. I at least imagine and I theorize that could lead to better sleep.
Intuitively
I don't
makes
have data
sense,
though.
right?
I don't have data. And that's important.
It intuitively makes sense. The more stimulating something is, the more it's likely to wake you up and keep you awake. Right.
Well, hey, hopefully this episode did not put you asleep. Hopefully you did find at least some of this
I like that, Logan.
Entertaining. Yep, see? I almost sound like a professional podcaster, Joon. Hey, we've done some great work here, so please subscribe. We're on all the social media shenanigans. We have a lot of great episodes now. I think we're up to like 26 now. So give us a follow. Share us with someone who you think could be a benefit. We're trying to really reach people that have a special interest in mental health. If that's people that work in mental health, maybe their family has been severely impacted with someone with mental illness. Thank you so much for tuning in. We greatly appreciate it.